It was about responsibility versus duty, and what makes an action, any action that you might do, good or bad, and how you can know for yourself whether what you're doing is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. How do you decide what to do? So firstly, just about learning to see the difference between what is duty and what is responsibility. Actually, for developing the correct practice of Dhamma, it's a problem to see things that you do as your duty, as an obligation, compulsory. Feeling obliged to do something or to behave in a certain way is a big problem in Dhamma. And that's what a duty is. It's when you feel obliged that it's just I have to do this. That's the only reason you give yourself for doing something, because I have to do this. I'm obliged to do it. It's my duty. And the problem with acting out of a sense of duty like this is that as far as you're feeling obliged to do something, then you're not seeing the fact that to do this action or not to do it is actually your choice. And because you're not seeing that it's your choice, you're not taking responsibility for it. So to illustrate this point, one example could be that, for example, a doctor has many things that he has to do each day for all his patients, and might prescribe them different medicine and say, okay, you need to take this treatment and that treatment and so on. And all of these things he's doing out of his duty as a doctor. He's just, okay, because I'm a doctor, I have to, this is my job and so on. And suppose one day then he's asked to give a person a lethal injection, euthanasia. This comes up in his job. If he then decides to give the lethal injection, he has decided to do that. And he is entirely responsible for that action. He's chosen to give a lethal injection that will kill a human being. But as a doctor, you'd be able to do this. Many doctors anyway will be able to do it quite easily and without even thinking about it, without any misgivings, without, worrying about it too much. And why is that? If before becoming a doctor, then somebody had asked him to help them commit suicide, for example, would he have done the same thing with the same ease and, lack of concern? And the answer is no, because then he would have really known that it was his decision to do this, that is totally on him, whether he does this or not. And he would have really needed to justify to himself why he should do this or not. And the reason that then as a doctor he doesn't need to do that is because he just sees it as his duty. It's my job. And all his actions are just done because I'm a doctor. And that's his only reason for doing it. And so therefore, he doesn't feel that heavy weight of all of these choices he makes every day as a doctor, which can have big consequences for many people, and for which he alone, in fact, can be held responsible. It made me remember also that line from one of the suttas where the man who has died is sitting in front of the king Yama. And what does he say to him? He's telling him this. He's telling him all of those things that you just had no concern for or that you weren't taking responsibility for. That wrong action wasn't done by your mother or your father or your relatives or your friends or your country or your kinsmen or the gods. It was done by you and you alone will experience its results. So it means you are responsible for everything you do. And the problem is then, when you're not seeing your full responsibility for things, it's very dangerous, because whether you're taking responsibility or not, your own actions will still have results. So that doctor will still have to pay for the results or have the results, feel the results of all of those actions he's done as a doctor. So learning to see the difference between taking responsibility for something as saying, okay, I'm responsible for the choices I make, and feeling just something is a duty, that's really quite important to be able to start practicing Dhamma properly. In war as well, I could give another example that at least if you go to war, you know what kind of things you're going to be asked to be doing, and it's sort of quite obvious too. But at the same time, you can just say, I'm a soldier and I have to just do what I'm told. I'm following orders, and that's your job. And you kind of ignore the fact that you actually do have a choice. Everything you're asked to do, whether as a soldier or a doctor or in whatever position, you can always refuse to do it. You can say no to do it. And sure, there will be consequences then. You will have to face consequences, and maybe quite serious or unpleasant consequences for the fact of refusing to do something that you know is a wrong action. but you can decide always to choose not to do it. And Ajahn gave the example of the story about the village that was massacred in Vietnam, My Lai. And there was just one soldier among several who were interviewed afterwards who said that he had just point blank refused to take part in the massacre, while all the others had done so. And now, while at the time they all thought, oh yeah, we're following orders and everything, and they didn't realize it, all that long time afterwards, many, many years afterwards, most of them were still suffering the results of what they themselves had done that day. They had to live with it. While this guy, he didn't know at the time whether maybe he would be executed or he would go to prison or what might happen. But at that time, several years later, he was the only one who had a clear conscience and who was able to sleep well at night. So yeah, it's always your choice. And something that's interesting and kind of important too is that actually generally we are not very happy to see the extent of our own responsibility for the things we do. We don't like choices. We like duties. We like having an obligation to have somebody or someone or something telling us what we have to do. And even when a duty or an obligation is, heavy, burdensome, and we kind of, it's heavy on us, we tend to still prefer to hang on to the idea that we have to do it, that it's our duty, rather than realize that it's actually our choice and that we could always choose not to do it. And why is that? Because, well, decisions are difficult and frightening for people. And then, as soon as you realize that you have a decision to make, instead of just feeling I have to do something, then, you start to have doubts, you can have worries, then you find yourself looking for a rule book somewhere to tell you whether you should do this A or B, or asking someone, or feeling the need to explain to yourself or justify to yourself why you chose A over B, and worrying whether it was the right thing or not. All of these things arise when something has been a decision that you yourself had to make and you were fully responsible for. So just going back to the example of the doctor, if the doctor realizes he could refuse to give a lethal injection and perform euthanasia, then if he still decides to do it, what's his real reason for choosing to do it? Let's say if he has some kind of misgiving and he doesn't really want to do it, but he still decides to do it, how will he justify this to himself? He has to then he can't just say, oh, it's my duty. Now he knows that he has a choice. But then he'll have to maybe realize that actually, okay, I'm just doing it because I don't want to have to go through the bother of having to explain to my colleagues and superiors, or worse, risking my job, for the sake of not doing it. So finally, it's my own selfishness that's pushing me to do this. So basically, it forces you to become more honest with yourself about the motivations for your actions. And then the point that this is leading to as well is to start to understand that once you start taking responsibility properly, what is very important and also quite liberating and wonderful is that when you can understand that what's important in the vast majority of cases is not whether you do action A or action B, it's what's your reason for doing things. That's also important to start to understand the difference between your reason for doing something and the sort of outside excuse that you can give for your action. So like the doctor can justify his action to himself by talking about, oh yeah, the patient is in pain, the hospital needs this, I need to, all kinds of things, external things that, I'll cause trouble for everybody. But is that his reason for doing it? That's not his reason. It's just bunch of external things that are happening outside of him, but that doesn't need to be his reason for doing the action. And his reason is it really a good thing inside me that is pushing me to do this action or not? In the case of the doctor, it's fairly obvious in Dhamma that it's always wrong to perform the euthanasia. Your reason for deciding to do that cannot be a good one. That's in the case of the 5 precepts, those are actions that cannot be done for a good reason. So that's why they are the 5 things that should never be done. But in the case of many, many, many actions, they can be done for good reasons or bad reasons. So they can be either actually good or bad, depending on what's driving you. So to give an example of a case where you could do either A or B. Let's say, for example, you haven't had a holiday from a work. Let's say they're a nurse working at a hospital and it's been a long time since they got a holiday and they're very tired and feeling burned out, and now it's their first day off and they're feeling just relieved to have the holiday. And then finally at some point in the morning their boss calls them and asks them, actually, can you please come in? Somebody has cancelled. We need you today. But it's up to you. You can stay home. We will manage, but it would be good if you could come in. So now what do they do? Is it good to go to work or not? And now there's no rule book. There's nothing to tell you, okay, it's always good to go to work. You might feel, it's just my duty to go to work. But then you're not seeing what's your real reason for doing it. You're just taking that to be your reason. So that's not good. So then you have to see, okay, what's inside? If you're just, for example, at that time, I don't feel like going. I really don't want to go. I'm too tired. It's just something that's disagreeable and I don't want to do. And I prefer to relax and stay at home. If you just kind of follow this emotion or follow this, physical state and say, okay, I don't want to do it. I don't feel like doing it. I won't go. That's obviously not a good reason either, because then you're just being controlled by your emotion, your mental state, and that's not a good reason. But if you don't want to do it and everything, but you still just feel obliged to go and you do it anyway, it's maybe a bit better, but it's not much better, because you're just doing it because of feeling obliged for somebody else, but it's not for yourself. It has no real benefit. And if you keep doing that kind of thing, problem is as well, you become kind of resentful and you feel heavy, and the more things you do out of a sense of duty, but not from yourself, the more resentful and heavy it becomes. But you can also in that time see, okay, for example, could I decide to go, for example, if I were to decide to go, not just to please the other person, or not just because it's my duty, but because I actually don't want to be controlled by this feeling or this heaviness or this emotion or just this tiredness. I don't want to be the slave of that. So to train myself to go beyond that, I will go and do it for myself as a training, as a practice of Dhamma. Well, then it's good. Then it's part of your practice. Then you're doing it for yourself, from yourself. And then you can do it out with lightness, because now it's not just because somebody asked you to do. You did take the decision to do it. It's not just your duty or your obligation. It's something that you see will bring you benefit, because now you're training yourself to be stronger. You're training your mind to be stronger than your emotion. But you could even have a good reason that's similar for deciding not to go as well. Like you could see, for example, okay, now I have this, horrible kilesa and heaviness and dislike and resistance to the idea of going inside, and that's not good. I don't want that. But why do I have that? Because I've just been burned out and working non-stop for ages. So actually, maybe what is more beneficial is for me to not go out of the wish to make sure that today I can, let's say do Dundrun Grum all day if you're a meditator, and make sure to put myself in a better mental state in which I will be able to take clear decision, in which I will be able to have a perspective from which I won't be just pulled by my emotion all the time. And for, tomorrow and future days, I will be able to do my work with joy and not out of a sense of obligation and duty and feeling kind of hatred and resentment. So, in either action A or action B, there is a good reason for doing it and there's a bad reason for doing it. So it doesn't really matter which one you do. What's much more important is finding what's the good reason for doing it. And that's what's going to make it beneficial or not beneficial. And also importantly, it's what makes you independent as opposed to dependent. Like if you're doing something always as a duty and you're always waiting for something else or somebody else to tell you what to do or to tell you what's good or bad, then you're always dependent on that other person and you're just dependent on something else. But when you start seeing that you're responsible for your actions and you start seeing that you can always know for yourself whether your action is motivated by something good or bad, and you can always decide to train yourself and have a good reason to do something, then you're becoming more independent. So it means you don't need somebody else to tell you whether what you're doing is good or bad, because you know for yourself. There's no rule book or something outside. You just know for yourself at this moment, okay, I'm not motivated by something bad. So even if you decide to stay home, for example, that day, and now somebody else criticizes you afterwards, no, you knew for yourself, you understood what was inside you, you calculated it, and you realized, no, it was not out of a bad reason. So I don't care what somebody else says. Or if you decide to go and somebody else criticizes, oh, you're just a slave of the hospital or whatever. No, I know I wasn't a slave of the hospital. I took the decision to go for myself, to train myself. So you're becoming independent. And it's a training to become independent, which is what the practice of Dhamma is, to be independent of everything.